There comes a moment in life when explaining yourself starts to drain more energy than it brings clarity. No explanation reaches a heart that doesn't want to open. When you realize some people are not confused about you, but are choosing to misunderstand you, and no amount of words can reach a heart that has already shut itself. Buddhism teaches that suffering often begins not from what others think of us, but from our attachment to being understood, validated, and justified in the eyes of the world. When you stop explaining, detach quietly, and return to stillness, something deep begins to unfold. Life itself begins to speak on your behalf. Truth no longer needs your defense. Reality becomes the witness. And slowly, without force or struggle, everything hidden begins to reveal itself. 1. Stop explaining to those who have already decided who you are. In Buddhist wisdom, suffering often begins the moment we cling to something that cannot be controlled. And one of the most draining forms of this clinging is the need to correct someone who has already made up their mind about us. When a person has decided who you are, they are no longer listening to understand. They are only listening to confirm what they already believe. At that point, every word you speak passes through their assumptions, their past experiences, their ego, and their emotional filters. Not through openness or compassion. You may explain yourself calmly, honestly, and with pure intention, yet nothing shifts, because the misunderstanding was never based on lack of information. It was a choice. It was rooted in judgment, fear, jealousy, insecurity, or the need to feel right rather than to see truth. Buddhism teaches that right speech is powerful only when the listener is present with awareness. Awareness means the ability to listen without attachment, without resistance, and without the need to defend an inner narrative. When awareness is absent, words lose their healing power and instead become a source of exhaustion. You repeat yourself, you justify, you clarify, and yet the weight on your heart grows heavier instead of lighter. This is because you are trying to plant seeds in soil that has already been hardened. No matter how pure the seed is, it cannot grow where the ground refuses to open. Silence, in this context, is not weakness or surrender. It is wisdom. It is the awareness that your peace matters more than winning an argument, and your inner balance is worth more than fixing someone's wrong view of you. When you stop trying to explain yourself to a closed mind, you stop wasting energy, you stop feeding confusion, you stop taking part in a cycle that keeps you emotionally connected to someone else's misunderstanding. Detachment starts the moment you understand that you do not need to prove your truth to anyone for it to stay real. Your actions, your consistency, and your way of living will speak much louder than any explanation ever can. Buddhism teaches that attachment to being understood creates suffering because understanding cannot be forced. When you let go of this attachment, you free yourself from the constant need to defend who you are. You step back, not in anger, but in clarity. You allow people to hold whatever image they choose, knowing that their perception says more about their inner state than it does about your reality. In that letting go, the heart becomes lighter, the mind becomes calmer, and peace returns naturally because you are no longer fighting a battle that was never meant to be won through words. 2. Detachment is not coldness. It is trust in truth and time. Many people misunderstand detachment and believe it means becoming emotionally cold, distant, or uncaring. But Buddhism teaches something far deeper and more compassionate. Detachment is not about shutting your heart down. It is about releasing your grip on outcomes that were never under your control. When you detach quietly, you are not rejecting people or situations. You are trusting truth, time, and natural consequences to do what your words cannot. You understand that reality has its own intelligence, and it does not need your constant interference to reveal what is real and what is false. In life, there is a strong urge to explain yourself immediately, to correct misunderstandings before they grow, and to protect your image before it is damaged. This urge often comes from fear, the fear of being seen wrongly, the fear of losing respect, or the fear of being unfairly judged. Buddhism teaches that acting from fear only deepens suffering, because fear narrows the mind and pulls you away from awareness. When you detach, you choose trust over fear. You trust that truth does not expire just because it is temporarily unseen, and you trust that time always exposes what words are forced to hide. Detachment means stepping back and allowing people to reveal themselves through their behavior rather than through confrontation. Someone who is genuine will stay consistent over time, even without giving explanations. Someone who acts from dishonesty will eventually expose themselves, no matter how convincing their words sound in the moment. Buddhism highlights impermanence, and within impermanence, masks cannot remain forever. When you stop trying to control situations through explanation, you let this natural process happen without resistance. There is deep relief in detachment because it releases your nervous system from constant alertness. You no longer feel the need to track how others view you or respond to every misunderstanding. Your mind grows quieter, your body relaxes, and your emotional energy comes back to you. Instead of using your strength to defend yourself, you use it to live honestly and peacefully. This is why detachment is not weakness, but a form of inner strength. It requires patience, self-trust, and the courage to let things unfold without control. Buddhism teaches that peace comes when you stop forcing clarity and allow understanding to emerge on its own. Detachment is the moment you accept that some lessons are not taught through explanation, but through observation and time. When you trust this process, you stop chasing validation and start resting in your own truth. And in that stillness, life begins to align naturally, revealing who is genuine, who is temporary, and what no longer belongs on your path. 3. Silence protects your inner peace better than any explanation ever can. In Buddhism, inner peace is not something you fight for or argue your way toward. It is something you protect by choosing awareness over reaction. Every time you feel the urge to explain yourself, defend your intentions, or correct someone's misunderstanding, your mind becomes engaged in conflict, even if your words are gentle. This mental engagement quietly pulls you away from stillness and plants seeds of agitation inside you. Buddhism teaches that the mind follows attention, and when your attention is repeatedly pulled toward justification and defense, peace slowly slips away without you even noticing. Silence becomes powerful not because it hides truth, but because it prevents unnecessary suffering. When words are spoken to someone who is not listening with openness, they do not bring clarity, they bring friction. Each explanation invites another question, another doubt, another emotional reaction. And before long, you are trapped in a cycle where peace is constantly postponed. Buddhism reminds us that not every thought needs to be spoken, and not every misunderstanding has to be fixed. Wisdom is knowing when words support harmony and when silence protects balance. When you choose silence, you are not hiding your truth. You are respecting your nervous system and guarding your emotional energy. Silence keeps your mind open and spacious, instead of filled with arguments you replay again and again. It gives your heart space to settle, instead of tightening with frustration, resentment, or disappointment. Over time, you start to see that calm is not fragile, it simply needs fewer disruptions. And many of those disruptions come from unnecessary explanations. Buddhist teachings encourage mindful restraint, meaning you respond only when a response supports peace and growth. Silence becomes a boundary that shows you are no longer available for emotional chaos or endless clarification. It prevents others from pulling you into their confusion and forces them to sit with their own interpretations instead of feeding on your reactions. This is why silence often feels uncomfortable to others, because it removes their control over your emotional state. As you practice silence, you begin to feel a quiet strength emerge. You no longer rush to fill space with words or prove your goodness through explanation. You trust your inner alignment more than external validation. Your peace becomes steady because it is no longer dependent on being understood. Buddhism teaches that when the mind stops chasing resolution outside, clarity arises within. Silence becomes not an escape, but a return to your natural state of balance, where nothing needs to be defended and nothing essential is under threat. 4. Let life expose people and situations without your interference. One of the most profound teachings in Buddhism is the understanding that truth does not need to be forced, defended, or pushed into the light, because whatever is real naturally reveals itself over time. Much of human suffering comes from the urge to intervene in this process, to speed it up, or to control how and when truth appears. When misunderstandings arise or people act unfairly, the instinct is to explain, confront, and clarify immediately, believing that silence will allow falsehood to grow stronger. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Falsehood survives only through resistance, while truth survives through patience. When you step back and detach quietly, you are not avoiding reality, you are allowing reality to unfold without distortion. People reveal who they are not through arguments, but through repetition. Their patterns, reactions, and choices slowly tell a story that no explanation could ever replace. Someone who acts with sincerity will remain steady across time, even when no one is watching. Someone who hides behind deception may appear convincing for a moment, but impermanence guarantees that cracks will eventually form. This is why Buddhism places so much emphasis on observation rather than reaction. When you observe without interfering, clarity arises naturally. Interference often grows from emotional urgency. You want to correct the story because being misunderstood feels painful, unfair, and threatening to your sense of self. But Buddhism teaches that the self you are trying to protect is not as delicate as you think. When you detach, you start to see that constantly defending yourself does not make you stronger. It traps you in the same confusion you want to leave. Each explanation keeps you emotionally tied to the situation, letting it live in your mind long after the talk is over. Detachment gently cuts this tie, allowing the situation to settle without stealing your inner peace. Life moves in its own timing, and wisdom is trusting that timing instead of fighting it. When you stay calm and quiet, people get space to act freely, and in that freedom, their true nature appears. Words can be practiced, intentions can be hidden, and appearances can be controlled, but behavior over time cannot be faked. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to create fear, but to reassure you that nothing false can last forever. When you understand this deeply, you stop feeling the need to expose anyone yourself, because you know exposure is already part of reality. There is compassion in this choice. By not interfering, you are not attacking or shaming anyone. You are simply stepping back and letting cause and effect unfold naturally. This protects your heart from bitterness and keeps your mind free from obsession. You stop watching others closely and return your attention to your own awareness, your own conduct, and your own peace. Buddhism teaches that liberation begins when you stop managing the world and start mastering your response to it. As you practice this quiet detachment, you begin to notice something powerful. Situations that once felt confusing slowly become clear without effort. People who once caused doubt reveal themselves without confrontation. What no longer aligns with you begins to fall away on its own. This is not coincidence. It is the natural result of non-interference. When you stop forcing truth, truth rises by itself. When you stop explaining, life explains everything for you. And in that unfolding, peace replaces struggle, understanding replaces frustration, and wisdom replaces the need to be right. 5. Release the need to control how others see you. One of the most subtle yet painful sources of suffering, according to Buddhist wisdom, is the desire to control perception, the need to manage how others see us, speak about us, or judge our actions. This desire often hides behind good intentions, such as wanting fairness, clarity, or respect. But beneath it lies attachment, the attachment to identity, reputation, and approval. When you are attached to how others see you, your peace becomes fragile because it depends on something you can never fully control. Buddhism teaches that anything your peace depends on will eventually become a source of suffering. The mind constantly seeks reassurance that it is seen correctly, valued properly, and understood accurately. When that reassurance is threatened, the instinct is to explain, justify, and defend. You begin to replay conversations in your head, thinking of better words, stronger arguments, and clearer explanations, believing that if you just say the right thing, misunderstanding will dissolve. Buddhism gently reveals the truth that this effort rarely brings peace. Instead, it keeps the mind trapped in endless mental activity where clarity is postponed and calm feels unreachable. Releasing the need to control perception is not an act of defeat, it is an act of wisdom. It means accepting that people will always see you through the lens of their own experiences, fears, wounds, and expectations. Their perception is shaped far more by who they are than by who you are. When you understand this deeply, you stop taking misunderstanding personally. You no longer feel responsible for correcting every false idea or defending every quiet truth. You let others keep their version of the story while you stay grounded in your own awareness. Buddhism teaches surrender, not as quitting, but as releasing unnecessary struggle. When you let go of the need to control narratives, your nervous system starts to relax. The constant alertness that comes from protecting your image slowly fades, and your mind returns to the present moment. You begin to live more honestly, not changing your behavior to be seen a certain way, but acting in line with your values no matter the judgment around you. This alignment builds a deep inner stability that no opinion can disturb. There is real freedom in understanding that your worth does not rise when others praise you, and does not fall when they misunderstand you. Buddhism reminds us that the self we defend so strongly is not fixed, solid, or permanent. When you loosen your grip on identity, criticism loses its sting and praise loses its hold. You stop judging your life by how it appears outside and start feeling it from within, where peace is calm and steady. As you release control, you may notice some people feel uneasy. They may push harder for explanations or reactions because your detachment takes away their influence. This discomfort is not your responsibility. Buddhism teaches compassion without self-sacrifice. You can remain kind without being entangled. You can remain silent without being passive. You can walk away without resentment. Releasing control does not make you invisible. It makes you free. Over time, something remarkable happens. When you stop managing perception, life begins to align naturally. The right people understand you without effort. The wrong ones drift away without conflict. You no longer waste energy correcting misunderstandings that were never meant to be resolved. Instead, you invest your attention in living truthfully, peacefully, and consciously. This is the quiet liberation Buddhism points toward, the freedom that arises when you stop explaining who you are and simply become it. 6. Detachment quietly reveals who deserves access to your life. Buddhism teaches that not all connections are meant to last, and not all people who enter your life are meant to stay close to your heart. Much of our suffering comes from giving too much access to those who have not earned it, and from trying to maintain connections that quietly disturb our peace. When you stop explaining yourself and begin to detach quietly, a natural filtering process begins to take place. This process does not require confrontation, harsh boundaries, or dramatic endings. It happens gently through awareness and stillness. When you are constantly explaining, justifying, and defending yourself, you are offering emotional access. You are inviting others into your inner world, even when they approach without respect or understanding. Buddhism teaches mindful association because energy matters. Every interaction leaves an imprint on the mind. When you detach, you stop overgiving your attention and emotional labor. You begin to conserve your energy, and in doing so, you observe who remains present without demanding explanations and who slowly disappears when they can no longer extract reactions from you. Detachment exposes intentions without words. Some people are drawn to you only when you are available for emotional exchange, validation, or control. They feel comfortable when you explain yourself because it keeps you engaged and predictable. When you become quiet and grounded, they feel unsettled, not because you have changed, but because their access has changed. Buddhism teaches that when attachment is removed, true relationships become visible. Those who value you for your presence, sincerity, and consistency will remain connected without pressure. Those who relied on confusion, emotional dependency, or drama will drift away naturally. This separation can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you are used to maintaining harmony at the cost of your own peace. The mind may question whether you are being distant, selfish, or unkind. Buddhism reminds us that compassion does not mean self-abandonment. You can care deeply while still protecting your inner space. Detachment is not rejection, it is discernment. It is recognizing that access to your time, thoughts, and emotions is sacred and should be given intentionally, not automatically. As you continue practicing quiet detachment, you begin to notice how your relationships change. Conversations become calmer, expectations decrease, the pressure to perform, explain, or defend disappears. You no longer feel responsible for fixing misunderstandings or soothing others' discomfort. Instead, you allow each person to meet you where you are, without negotiation. Buddhism teaches that clarity appears when we stop forcing connection and let alignment show itself naturally. A deep sense of relief also comes with this awareness. You stop asking why certain relationships feel heavy, draining, or confusing. Detachment helps you see that the weight was never created by silence, but by imbalance. When balance returns through boundaries and awareness, peace comes back on its own. You start to feel lighter, not because people disappear, but because unnecessary attachment loosens its hold. Over time, detachment builds a stronger sense of self-respect. You stop chasing understanding or closeness where it is not freely offered. You realize that real connection does not need constant explanation or emotional bargaining. Buddhism teaches that harmony grows when each person stands steady in their own awareness. When you live this truth, your life becomes quieter, your relationships become clearer, and your heart becomes more stable. In this calm clarity, you begin to trust yourself more deeply. You recognize that not everyone needs access to your inner world, and that this does not diminish your kindness or humanity. Instead, it preserves them. Detachment quietly teaches you who belongs in your life, not through rejection or judgment, but through alignment. Those who respect your silence, honor your boundaries, and meet you with sincerity remain. Everything else fades without resistance. This is the wisdom of detachment, not harsh, not cold, but deeply compassionate toward yourself and your peace. 7. Peace returns when you stop resisting life and return to your inner stillness. Buddhism teaches that peace is not something you acquire from the world, but something you uncover when you stop resisting what is already happening. Much of human suffering does not come from events themselves, but from the inner struggle to control, explain, or correct those events. When misunderstandings arise, or when people act unfairly, the mind instinctively tightens, searching for ways to defend identity, protect image, or restore a sense of order. This inner resistance creates tension, restlessness, and emotional fatigue. Detachment quietly dissolves this struggle by guiding you back to stillness, where peace naturally resides. Returning to inner stillness does not mean withdrawing from life or becoming passive. It means meeting life without inner conflict. Buddhism teaches mindful acceptance, which is the ability to observe experiences without clinging or aversion. When you stop explaining and detach quietly, you release the need to manipulate outcomes. You no longer argue with reality or replay conversations in search of better words. Instead, you rest in awareness, allowing thoughts and emotions to arise and pass without pulling you into their current. This shift from resistance to observation is where true peace begins. Inner stillness allows you to see clearly. When the mind is no longer agitated by the need to be understood or validated, perception becomes sharper and more honest. You begin to recognize that many of the battles you were fighting were internal, not external. Buddhism teaches that the mind creates suffering when it identifies too strongly with thoughts and stories. By returning to stillness, you loosen this identification. You observe misunderstandings without becoming them. You notice judgment without absorbing it. You experience life without constantly defending your place within it. As stillness deepens, emotional reactions soften. Situations that once triggered anxiety, anger, or the urge to explain lose their power. Not because you have suppressed emotion, but because awareness has expanded. You understand that emotions are temporary movements of the mind, not commands that must be followed. Buddhism emphasizes impermanence to remind us that nothing, including discomfort, lasts forever. When you trust this truth, you stop rushing to fix what will naturally pass. Peace grows from patience, not from control. There is also a profound sense of freedom in returning to inner stillness. You no longer feel like life is happening to you in a threatening way. Instead, you experience yourself as part of life's flow. You stop separating yourself from what is happening and begin moving with it rather than against it. Buddhism teaches non-resistance, not as resignation, but as harmony with reality. When you move in harmony with this, life feels less heavy. You save energy, your clarity grows, and presence takes the place of anxiety. As you live from stillness, people respond in new ways. Some may feel confused by your calm. Some may misunderstand your silence. Some may try to pull you back into explaining or reacting. Buddhism teaches gentle firmness in these moments. You stay kind without giving up your peace. You stay open without getting tangled. You understand that your inner state is your responsibility, and protecting it is not selfish but necessary for mindful living. Over time, this practice changes your whole relationship with life, and you begin to trust yourself more deeply. You no longer fear being misunderstood because your sense of self is rooted within, not constructed externally. You experience a quiet confidence that does not need affirmation. This confidence is not loud or assertive. It is grounded and calm. It comes from knowing that nothing essential can be taken from you through misunderstanding or silence. Buddhism ultimately teaches that liberation is the end of unnecessary struggle. When you stop explaining, detach quietly, and return to inner stillness, You free yourself from the endless cycle of reaction and resistance. Peace becomes your natural state again, not because the world has changed, but because you have stopped fighting it. In that stillness, clarity emerges, truth reveals itself, and life unfolds with a gentleness you no longer need to control. 8. True freedom begins when you no longer need a response from the world. Buddhism teaches that the deepest form of freedom does not come from changing the world, correcting people, or achieving perfect understanding from others, but from releasing the inner dependence on response itself. Much of our emotional exhaustion comes from waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for validation, waiting for an apology, waiting for someone to finally see our side of the story. This waiting ties our peace to external movement, and whenever peace depends on something outside of us, it becomes fragile and unstable. Detachment quietly ends this waiting by bringing attention back to where freedom has always lived, within awareness itself. The need for response is subtle. It does not always appear as desperation or loud demand. Sometimes it appears as quiet hope that someone will finally understand, finally explain themselves, finally admit what they did, or finally recognize your effort and sincerity. Buddhism teaches that this hope, when attached to outcome, becomes suffering, not because hope is wrong, but because attachment to how life should respond creates tension between reality and expectation. When expectation is not met, the mind tightens, searching for explanations, rehearsing conversations, and replaying moments that can no longer be changed. Detachment teaches you to step out of this loop gently, without bitterness or withdrawal. You begin to see that waiting for response keeps you emotionally tethered to others' behavior. It gives them unconscious control over your inner state. When they respond kindly, you feel relief. When they remain silent or dismissive, you feel unsettled. Buddhism invites you to reclaim this power by no longer outsourcing your peace to reaction. You understand that your calm does not need permission, and your clarity does not require agreement. As you release the need for response, something shifts inside you. Your mind becomes less reactive and more spacious. You stop interpreting silence as rejection and disagreement as threat. You realize that not every situation needs closure in the form you imagined. Buddhism teaches that closure often comes not from answers, but from acceptance. When you accept that some people cannot meet you where you stand, you stop bending yourself into explanations that were never meant to land. This release creates emotional independence, which is not isolation, but maturity. You are no longer pulled into cycles of anticipation and disappointment. You no longer check for signs, signals, or reactions to measure your worth. Instead, you ground yourself in presence. You observe thoughts and emotions without feeding them stories. You allow life to move without constantly asking it to reassure you. Buddhism teaches that freedom is the end of craving, and craving often hides in the need to be responded to. With time, you notice how light this freedom feels. Situations that once felt heavy lose their grip. Conversations no longer echo endlessly in your mind. You no longer feel the urge to chase clarity from people who are unavailable or unwilling. You allow their silence to remain theirs without carrying it inside you. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional sovereignty. You feel deeply, but you do not cling. As this practice deepens, your relationship with yourself transforms. You begin to trust your own understanding more than external confirmation. You listen inwardly instead of scanning outwardly. Buddhism teaches that wisdom arises from direct experience, not from consensus. When you live from this truth, your confidence becomes quiet and stable. You stop asking the world to explain itself to you, and you stop explaining yourself to the world. Others may notice this shift. Some may feel drawn to your calm presence. Some may feel unsettled by your lack of need. This is not something you manage or respond to. You simply remain grounded. Buddhism teaches that when attachment dissolves, clarity remains. You are no longer waiting for permission to move forward. You move because movement feels natural, not because response demands it. True freedom begins when you realize that peace does not arrive through answers, reactions, or recognition. It arrives when the mind stops reaching outward and rests inwardly. When you no longer need a response from the world loses its power to disturb you. You remain present, aware, and open, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing essential is missing. This is the quiet liberation Buddhism points toward, the freedom that arises when the need for response dissolves and life is allowed to unfold without inner resistance. 9. Letting go of explanation is the final step into inner liberation. Buddhism teaches that true liberation does not come from fixing every misunderstanding, correcting every false belief, or defending oneself against every misjudgment, but from ending the inner struggle that demands these actions in the first place. At the deepest level, the urge to explain is not about communication, it is about attachment. It is the attachment to identity, to fairness, to being seen accurately, and to controlling how one exists in the minds of others. As long as this attachment remains active, the mind cannot fully rest. Liberation begins when this attachment is gently released. The need to explain often arises when the sense of self feels threatened. When someone misunderstands you, judges you unfairly, or speaks about you in a way that feels untrue, the mind reacts as if something essential is being taken away. Buddhism teaches that this reaction is rooted in a mistaken belief that the self is fixed, solid, and dependent on external recognition. When you believe that who you are must be defended through words, you place your peace in the hands of others. Letting go of explanation is the moment you reclaim that peace. This does not mean that truth no longer matters. Buddhism does not teach indifference to truth, but freedom from attachment to outcome. You can live truthfully without constantly proving your truth. You can act with integrity without narrating your intentions. When you stop explaining, you are not abandoning clarity. You are trusting that clarity emerges through presence, consistency, and time. Life becomes your expression, not your defense. Letting go of explanation requires courage, because it means allowing misunderstandings to exist without rushing to resolve them. The mind fears that silence will confirm falsehood, that lack of defense will imply guilt, or that absence of explanation will cause permanent damage. Buddhism gently dismantles this fear by reminding us of impermanence. No misunderstanding is permanent, no false image lasts forever. The only thing that persists is the state of the heart that carries attachment or freedom. When you understand this deeply, urgency dissolves. As explanation fades, awareness deepens. You begin to notice how much mental energy was consumed by rehearsing conversations, anticipating judgment, and replaying moments where you wished you had said something differently. Buddhism teaches mindfulness as the art of seeing clearly, and clarity arrives when the mind is no longer crowded by imagined dialogues. You return to the present moment where life is actually happening instead of living in mental reenactments of the past or imagined corrections of the future. This return to presence creates inner spaciousness. Thoughts slow down, emotional reactivity softens. You become less concerned with being right and more interested in being free. Buddhism teaches that the desire to be right is often another form of attachment because it ties your sense of worth to comparison and conflict. When you let go of explanation, you step out of this cycle. You no longer need to win understanding. You simply remain aligned with awareness. Inner liberation also changes how you experience others. You stop viewing people as judges who must be convinced or corrected. Instead, you see them as individuals acting from their own conditioning, wounds, and perceptions. This shift brings compassion without self-sacrifice. You no longer personalize misunderstanding because you recognize that perception arises from the observer, not the observed. Buddhism teaches compassion rooted in wisdom, and wisdom understands that not every perception needs engagement. As attachment to explanation dissolves, silence becomes natural rather than forced. You are no longer silent as a strategy or defense, but because there is nothing urgent to say, this silence is not empty. It is full of clarity, groundedness, and calm. Others may interpret it in different ways, but their interpretation no longer dictates your inner state. You understand that your liberation does not depend on how silence is perceived, but on how deeply you inhabit it. With time, this practice reshapes your entire way of being. You move through life with less friction. Situations that once triggered anxiety now pass with minimal disturbance. You no longer feel compelled to intervene in every misunderstanding or narrative. You allow life to unfold while you remain rooted in awareness. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not escaping life, but finding freedom within it, and this freedom appears when resistance ends. Letting go of explanation also strengthens self-trust. You begin to depend on your own clarity instead of outside approval. You listen inwardly, checking whether your actions match your values rather than looking outward for praise. Buddhism teaches that wisdom comes from within, grown through observation and practice, not given through recognition. When you trust this wisdom, you no longer feel incomplete without validation. At this point, detachment no longer feels like something you are trying to do. It becomes part of who you are. You stop managing reactions, protecting stories, or fixing images. You are present, you respond when needed, you stay silent when right, and you remain peaceful no matter the result. This is not passivity, it is mastery. It is mastery of the inner world, which Buddhism teaches is the only world we are truly responsible for. Ultimately, letting go of explanation is the final doorway into inner liberation because it ends the constant negotiation between self and world. You stop bargaining for understanding and start resting in being. You accept that some people will never see you clearly, and this acceptance no longer hurts. It frees. You understand that your essence does not depend on perception, and your peace does not require agreement. Buddhism points toward this freedom not as an achievement, but as a return to stillness, to presence, to non-resistance. When explanation falls away, the mind rests. When the mind rests, suffering loosens. When suffering loosens, life flows. This is liberation, quiet, steady, and unshakable, not because the world finally understands you, but because you no longer need it to. Sometimes silence is stronger than explanation. Sometimes walking away is louder than arguing. In this video, we will practice quiet detachment, not to escape life, but to protect inner peace. Stay with me until the end, and let some journal prompts guide you back to yourself. 10. When you stop explaining, life aligns you with what is meant to stay. Buddhism teaches that life is not chaotic or random, but guided by causes and conditions that unfold naturally when we stop interfering out of fear. Much of what feels misaligned in life is not caused by fate, but by our constant effort to control outcomes, relationships, and perceptions through explanation, justification, and emotional negotiation. When you stop explaining yourself, something subtle yet profound begins to happen. Life starts to rearrange itself around your stillness. What belongs moves closer. What does not belong quietly moves away. Alignment replaces struggle. Explaining often comes from a place of fear, the fear of being misunderstood, rejected, abandoned, or judged unfairly. Buddhism teaches that fear narrows awareness and creates attachment to outcomes. When fear is active, we cling to people, situations, and narratives, even when they no longer serve peace. We speak not because words are needed, but because silence feels unsafe. We explain not because clarity is required, but because uncertainty threatens identity. Letting go of explanation is the moment you stop reacting to fear and begin responding from awareness. As you stop explaining, you also stop chasing. You stop chasing understanding from people who cannot give it. You stop chasing closure from situations that have already taught their lesson. You stop chasing fairness from a world that does not operate on personal timelines. Buddhism teaches that chasing creates exhaustion because it moves the mind away from the present moment. When you stop chasing, presence returns, and presence is where alignment begins. Alignment does not arrive with noise or announcement. It arrives quietly. You may notice that conversations feel fewer but deeper. Relationships feel calmer but more honest. Your days feel less crowded but more meaningful. This is because when explanation ends, unnecessary effort ends with it. You are no longer trying to maintain connections through emotional labor. You allow relationships to exist based on mutual awareness rather than constant clarification. Buddhism teaches that harmony arises when effort and resistance dissolve simultaneously. When you stop explaining, you also stop forcing yourself into places where you are not received. You no longer bend your truth to be understood. You no longer soften your boundaries to avoid discomfort. You no longer overextend kindness at the cost of self-respect. Buddhism does not teach self-sacrifice without wisdom. It teaches balance, and balance emerges naturally when you stop explaining why you deserve respect and simply live from self-respect. Life responds differently to this shift. Situations that once felt stagnant begin to move. Opportunities arise without struggle. Conflicts dissolve without resolution. This is not magic, it is alignment. When you are no longer resisting what is unfolding, you move in harmony with it. Buddhism teaches non-resistance, not as passivity, but as intelligent participation in reality. You act when action is needed. You speak when speech serves peace, and you remain silent when silence protects clarity. There is also a deep sense of relief that comes with alignment. You stop feeling like life is a test you must constantly pass. You stop feeling like you are on trial, defending your intentions, character, and worth. Instead, life feels cooperative rather than adversarial. Buddhism teaches that suffering lessens when we stop opposing life internally. When explanation ends, opposition ends. You no longer argue with what is happening. You observe it, learn from it, and move forward without resistance. Alignment also brings discernment. You begin to recognize which paths require force and which unfold naturally. Buddhism teaches that what is meant to stay does not require constant effort to hold together. When something belongs in your life, it flows with awareness rather than tension. When something does not belong, no amount of explanation will make it fit. Letting go of explanation allows this truth to become visible. You stop blaming yourself for what was never aligned to begin with. As alignment deepens, your inner life transforms. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer occupied with defending identity. The heart becomes steadier because it is no longer seeking reassurance. The body relaxes because it is no longer bracing for misunderstanding. Buddhism teaches that the body carries the imprint of mental struggle, and when struggle ends, the body follows. Peace is not only felt emotionally, it is embodied physically. When you stop explaining, You also begin to live more truthfully. You no longer perform goodness or narrate sincerity. You allow actions to speak quietly. Buddhism teaches that right action carries more wisdom than right speech when awareness is present. You become consistent rather than convincing, grounded rather than persuasive. This consistency creates a resonance that words cannot replicate. People who are aligned with you feel it without explanation. People who are not aligned drift away without conflict. There is profound dignity in this way of living. You stop shrinking or expanding yourself to fit expectations. You stop bargaining over your boundaries. You stand calmly in who you are without defense or apology. Buddhism teaches that dignity grows from awareness, not from recognition. When you live with awareness, you do not have to announce your worth. It is simply felt. Alignment also shifts how you experience uncertainty. Instead of fearing the unknown, you begin to trust it. Buddhism teaches impermanence not to create insecurity, but to free the mind from clinging. When you stop explaining, you stop trying to control what comes next. You let life unfold moment by moment. This trust builds resilience. You adjust without panic. You respond without fear. You keep moving forward without carrying the past with you. In time, you realize that stopping explanation was never only about silence. It was about ending the inner struggle with life. It was about releasing the belief that peace has to be earned through effort, clarity, or approval. Buddhism teaches that peace is discovered, not built. When explanation falls away, peace emerges naturally because nothing is blocking it anymore. Life aligns you not because you demanded it, but because you stopped resisting it. What stays feels lighter. What leaves feels necessary. You no longer cling to either. You understand that alignment is not about keeping everything, but about keeping what is true. This understanding brings deep contentment, not excitement, but steadiness, not control, but trust. In the end, stopping explanation becomes an act of faith. Not faith in people or outcomes, but faith in awareness itself. You trust that living consciously is enough. You trust that truth does not require defense. You trust that what is meant for you will meet you without force. Buddhism points toward this quiet faith as liberation, the state where life and awareness move together without conflict. When you stop explaining, detach quietly, and allow life to align you with what is meant to stay, you are no longer surviving the world. You are participating in it fully, calmly, and freely. This is not the end of the path. It is the moment you begin walking it without burden. 11. You no longer need to be seen when you finally see yourself clearly. Buddhism teaches that one of the deepest roots of suffering is the craving to be seen, recognized, and affirmed by others. This craving often hides behind noble desires such as fairness, honesty, or mutual understanding, but at its core, it is a longing for external confirmation of our inner worth. When you feel misunderstood, ignored, or unseen, the mind reacts by seeking visibility through explanation. You speak more, clarify more, and justify more, hoping that if others truly see you, the discomfort will finally dissolve. Buddhism gently reveals that this discomfort does not come from invisibility, but from the belief that your value depends on being perceived correctly by others. The moment you begin to see yourself clearly, the need to be seen externally starts to loosen. Seeing yourself clearly means understanding your intentions without doubt, recognizing your effort without applause, and knowing your integrity without needing agreement. Buddhism teaches self-awareness not as self-judgment, but as honest observation. When you observe yourself without distortion, you no longer rely on others to define who you are. Their opinions become information, not identity. Their misunderstanding becomes noise, not threat. Much of the urge to explain comes from inner uncertainty. When the mind is unsure of itself, it looks outward for confirmation. When someone questions you, misjudges you, or misunderstands your actions, that uncertainty flares, and the instinct is to correct their perception in order to stabilize your sense of self. Buddhism teaches that true stability comes from within, not from correction. When inner clarity is present, external misunderstanding loses its power to destabilize you. You no longer feel shaken by false impressions, because your foundation is not built on perception. Seeing yourself clearly also means accepting your imperfections without defensiveness. Buddhism does not teach perfection, it teaches awareness. When you know where you are still learning, growing, and healing, you do not feel threatened by criticism or misunderstanding. You no longer rush to explain yourself because you are not trying to protect a flawless image. You understand that being human includes being misread, misinterpreted, and sometimes judged unfairly. This acceptance brings humility, not weakness, and confidence, not arrogance. As this inner clarity deepens, you begin to notice how exhausting it was to constantly seek recognition. You remember how often your thoughts revolved around how you were perceived, how conversations replayed in your mind, how silence from others felt heavy and personal. Buddhism teaches mindfulness to reveal these patterns, not to shame you, but to free you. When awareness illuminates these habits, they lose their grip. You stop living in anticipation of being seen and start living in presence. When you see yourself clearly, your actions become quieter and more sincere. You no longer perform goodness for recognition or explain kindness for validation. You simply act in alignment with awareness. Buddhism teaches that right action flows naturally from right understanding. When understanding is rooted within, action no longer seeks applause. It becomes an expression rather than a message. Others may notice this shift, but whether they do or not, no longer determines your peace. This clarity also transforms how you experience invisibility. Moments when you are overlooked, misunderstood, or not acknowledged no longer feel like erasure. They become neutral experiences rather than emotional wounds. Buddhism teaches equanimity, the ability to remain balanced in praise and blame, recognition and neglect. When equanimity grows, visibility loses its emotional charge. You are no longer lifted by praise or diminished by silence. You remain steady, aware, and present. There is a profound freedom in no longer needing to be seen. You stop competing for attention. You stop comparing your path to others. You stop measuring your worth by response. Buddhism teaches that comparison is a form of ignorance because it pulls the mind away from its own direct experience. When you see yourself clearly, comparison dissolves. You are no longer trying to occupy a position in others' minds. You are inhabiting your own life fully. As this practice continues, your relationships change. You listen more deeply without needing to insert yourself. You speak with more intention without trying to dominate. You let others be who they are without needing them to mirror you back. Buddhism teaches compassionate presence, which becomes possible when the ego's hunger for recognition grows quiet. Your presence feels calming instead of demanding. People feel less pressure around you because you are no longer trying to take something from them. Seeing yourself clearly also brings responsibility. When you stop depending on outside validation, you cannot blame others for how you feel about yourself. Buddhism teaches personal responsibility, not as a burden, but as strength. You become responsible for your inner state, your reactions, and your awareness. This responsibility is freeing because it returns power to where it belongs. You stop waiting for others to change before you can feel peaceful. Peace becomes your own daily practice. There may still be moments when the old habit returns, moments when you want to be seen, understood, or recognized. Buddhism does not ask you to erase these moments, only to notice them with kindness. Awareness gently loosens attachment. Each time you notice the craving without acting on it, its hold weakens. Over time, the space between impulse and response widens, and silence becomes natural rather than forced. Eventually, you reach a point where being unseen no longer feels like loss. It feels like rest. You are no longer performing your life, you are living it. Buddhism teaches that liberation is the end of performance, the end of pretending to be something for someone else. When you stop explaining and stop seeking visibility, life becomes simpler, quieter, and more honest. In this simplicity, joy arises not from recognition, but from alignment. You wake up and live according to awareness, not approval. You act from clarity, not fear. You speak when it serves truth and remain silent when it preserves peace. This balance is not calculated, it is lived. Buddhism points to this way of being as freedom, the freedom that appears when the self no longer needs the world to reflect it back to feel real. When you finally see yourself clearly, you realize nothing essential was ever missing. You were never invisible. You were only searching outside for something that could only be found within. And in that realization, the need to be seen slowly fades, leaving a deep, quiet peace that does not depend on who notices it. 12. Silence becomes sacred when you no longer feel the need to prove your existence. Buddhism teaches that the deepest peace does not come from being heard, understood, or validated, but from resting fully in being. At this stage of inner growth, silence is no longer a reaction to the world or a method to protect yourself. It becomes sacred because it is no longer empty. It is filled with clarity, self-trust, and acceptance. When you no longer need to prove your existence through explanation, justification, or visibility, silence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like home. For much of life, the mind believes it must constantly announce itself to stay real. This belief creates endless noise, both inside and outside. Thoughts repeat explanations, emotions push for expression, identity looks for confirmation. Buddhism teaches that this noise is not life itself, but a habit of the mind shaped by fear and attachment. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being misunderstood, fear of not mattering. Silence becomes sacred when these fears no longer control behavior. When you stop explaining, you are not denying your experience. You are recognizing that your experience does not need outside permission to exist. Buddhism teaches that existence validates itself. You breathe, you are aware, you experience, therefore you are. Nothing needs to be added to this truth. When this understanding settles deeply, the urge to prove yourself softens. You no longer feel responsible for making others understand your inner world. You trust that what is real within you stays real no matter who recognizes it. At this level, silence is no longer uncomfortable. Earlier on the path, silence may have felt heavy, awkward, or unsafe. It may have felt like losing ground or giving up power. Buddhism teaches that discomfort often appears when attachment is loosening. As attachment to explanation fades, silence changes. It becomes spacious instead of tight. It becomes grounding instead of isolating. You no longer rush to fill gaps in conversation or defend pauses. You allow stillness to exist without judging it. Sacred silence also changes how you meet conflict. When misunderstandings happen, the mind no longer jumps forward to defend identity. You watch reactions without feeding them. You understand that not every misunderstanding threatens your truth, and not every judgment needs correction. Buddhism teaches non-reactivity, not as suppression, but as wisdom. When the mind is still, it clearly sees whether action is needed or whether silence is the most compassionate answer. Often, silence lets situations dissolve on their own, without leaving weight in the heart. As silence becomes sacred, you begin to feel less divided. Earlier, parts of you may have been scattered across conversations, explanations, and imagined dialogues. You carried pieces of yourself in other people's minds, worrying about how those pieces were held or twisted. Buddhism teaches that wholeness returns when attention turns inward. Sacred silence gathers the self back together. You feel more complete because you are no longer spread thin trying to manage perception. This wholeness brings dignity. You no longer feel the need to loudly announce boundaries or defend them harshly. Your presence communicates them naturally. Buddhism teaches that awareness has weight. When you are deeply rooted in awareness, words become optional instead of necessary. People may sense your steadiness without knowing why. Others may feel uneasy around your calm because it reflects their own restlessness. Neither reaction needs a response. Sacred silence allows each person to face themselves. Silence also deepens compassion. When you no longer need to prove yourself, you stop competing for space. You listen more openly. You let others express themselves without interruption or correction. Buddhism teaches compassionate listening as a form of generosity. Your silence becomes an offering instead of a withdrawal. You are present without agenda. You are attentive without needing to be central. This kind of presence heals more than explanation ever could. As this practice matures, life feels simpler. You wake without the weight of unfinished explanations. Your mind is not crowded with imagined arguments or defenses. You move through the day, responding instead of reacting. Buddhism teaches that simplicity is not lack, but freedom from excess. Sacred silence removes excess effort, excess worry, and excess self-consciousness. What remains is direct experience, moment by moment, clear and light. A deep sense of trust also begins to grow. You trust that what needs to be spoken will rise naturally. You trust that silence will not erase you. You trust that truth does not vanish when it is unspoken. Buddhism teaches trust in awareness itself. Awareness does not need reinforcement. It simply exists. When you rest in this trust, you stop rushing, you stop over-explaining, you stop fearing empty spaces. Life unfolds in its own rhythm, and you move with it instead of racing ahead. Sacred silence also reshapes how you relate to identity. You no longer define yourself by roles, labels, or stories that need constant upkeep. Buddhism teaches non-self, not as denial, but as freedom from rigid identity. When identity loosens, silence feels natural because there is less to defend. You do not disappear. You become flexible. You adjust without losing yourself. You respond without clinging. This flexibility brings resilience because you are no longer tied to a fixed image that can be threatened. In this state, even solitude feels different. It no longer feels like lack of connection, but presence with yourself. Buddhism teaches that solitude is fertile ground for insight when met with awareness. Sacred silence allows insight to rise gently. You notice subtle emotions, quiet intuitions, and small movements of the heart that were once drowned by noise. This sensitivity deepens wisdom not through analysis, but through presence. Eventually, you realize silence was never about holding back speech. It was about ending the inner urge to justify existence. When that urge ends, silence becomes peaceful instead of defensive. You speak when clarity is needed and stay silent when clarity already exists. There is no tension in either choice. Buddhism teaches the middle way, balance without force. Sacred silence expresses this balance naturally. At this final stage, you understand that nothing essential about you needs to be proven, announced, or explained. Your life is your expression. Your awareness is your truth. Your presence is your evidence. Buddhism points to this realization as liberation, not because the world finally understands you, but because you no longer depend on it too. Silence becomes sacred because it is no longer empty space waiting to be filled. It is full presence resting in itself, and in that presence nothing is missing, nothing is lacking, and nothing needs to be defended. 13. You stop explaining because you no longer feel separate from life itself. Buddhism teaches that much human suffering grows from a sense of separation, the feeling that you stand apart from life and must defend your place within it. This separation quietly feeds the need to explain, justify, and prove yourself. When you feel separate, every misunderstanding feels threatening, every judgment feels personal, and every silence feels like rejection. Explanation becomes a way to rebuild connection, to confirm your existence, and to secure your place in the world. As awareness deepens, this separation begins to fade, and with it, the need to explain slowly softens. At this stage, you no longer see life as something happening to you, but as something you belong to. Buddhism teaches interdependence, the understanding that nothing exists alone. When this understanding shifts from idea to lived experience, your relationship with others changes completely. You no longer feel like an object being judged, interpreted, or misunderstood from the outside. You experience yourself as a movement within life itself. From this place, explanation feels unnecessary because there is nothing to defend and no border that needs protection. Earlier on the path, explanation felt like survival. You spoke to protect identity, to clarify intention, and to guard your sense of self. Now identity has softened. You still know who you are, but you no longer cling to a fixed image that must be preserved. Buddhism teaches non-self, not as disappearance, but as freedom from rigid self-ideas. When the self becomes fluid, misunderstandings lose their sharpness. They no longer feel like attacks on something solid. They are simply perceptions, rising and fading within the flow of experience. This shift brings a deep calm. You stop reacting to how you are seen because perception no longer defines you. You understand that others experience you through their own conditioning, just as you experience them through yours. Buddhism teaches that perception is shaped by karma, habits, memories, and emotional patterns. When you see this clearly, you stop taking misunderstanding personally. It no longer feels like something you must repair. It feels like part of the natural variety of experience unfolding on its own. As separation fades, you notice your relationship with silence changing once more. Silence no longer feels like withdrawal or restraint. It feels natural, like the stillness of a lake, reflecting everything without distortion. Buddhism teaches that awareness itself is silent, even when sound appears within it. When you rest in awareness, speech becomes optional instead of required. You speak when words rise from compassion or clarity, not from fear or self-protection. Silence and speech become equal expressions of presence rather than opposites. In this state, explanation feels heavy because it assumes something is wrong or missing, yet nothing feels wrong or missing anymore. You no longer feel the need to fix situations that are simply unfolding through causes and conditions. Buddhism teaches acceptance not as resignation, but as closeness with reality. You are close to what is happening without trying to reshape it to match an inner story. This closeness removes urgency. You are no longer rushing to correct, clarify, or control. This does not mean you become passive or distant. Action still happens, but it comes from alignment rather than resistance. When something truly needs a response, you respond without hesitation or inner struggle. When silence is right, silence arrives easily. Buddhism teaches right action and right speech as expressions of awareness, not as strict rules. When awareness is present, Behavior aligns naturally without effort. You trust this alignment instead of doubting yourself. As this trust grows, you begin to feel a quiet joy. This joy does not come from approval or recognition. It comes from ease, the ease of not carrying a self that must be explained, the ease of not rehearsing conversations or defending intentions, the ease of not managing how you appear. Buddhism teaches that joy appears naturally when craving ends. When the craving to be understood fades, joy rests quietly in the background of daily life. You may notice relationships becoming simpler. Some connections deepen because they are built on presence rather than explanation. Others fall away because they depended on negotiation or identity support. This does not feel like loss. It feels like clarity. Buddhism teaches that attachment causes suffering not because things change, but because we resist change. When resistance ends, change feels natural. People come and go without drama. Situations settle without force. Life feels less crowded and more open. At this level, even misunderstanding becomes manageable without effort. You may still be misunderstood, but it no longer shakes your inner balance. You do not rush to explain because you are not carrying the misunderstanding inside you. Buddhism teaches that suffering appears when we identify with mental patterns. When identification loosens, thoughts and perceptions pass through awareness like clouds across the sky. They appear, shift and fade without leaving marks. You also begin to trust life more deeply. Earlier, explanation felt like a way to steer life toward fairness or clarity. Now you see that life does not need guidance from fear. Buddhism teaches trust in the Dharma, the natural order of things. When you trust this order, you stop interfering. You let lessons unfold. You allow consequences to teach. You allow truth to appear in its own time. This trust removes the urge to control stories or outcomes. Humility also appears at this stage. You recognize that you too misunderstand others at times. You see how perception is limited and personal. This humility softens judgment and deepens compassion. Buddhism teaches compassion rooted in wisdom, not superiority. You no longer feel above misunderstanding or below it. You see it as a shared human condition. This shared understanding creates gentleness toward yourself and others. As this lesson matures, you realize that stopping explanation was never about becoming silent forever. It was about becoming whole. When you feel whole, you do not need to push yourself into existence. You are already here. You are already part of life's movement. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be proven. Buddhism points to this realization as awakening, not dramatic or sudden, but quiet and steady. In this awakened way of being, life feels less personal and more intimate at the same time. Less personal because you are no longer defending a separate self. More intimate because you are fully present with each moment. You meet life directly, without armor, without performance, without explanation. This direct contact brings peace that does not depend on conditions. You stop explaining because explanation belongs to a time when you believed you were separate and needed to justify your place. Now you experience yourself as inseparable from life itself. You move with it. You rest inside it. You respond from it. Buddhism teaches that liberation is the end of separation, and when separation ends, the need to explain fades naturally. What remains is simple presence, quiet awareness, and a life lived without inner argument. You do not need to announce this understanding. You do not need to defend it. You live it, and by living it, you express the deepest teaching of detachment, not withdrawal from life, but full participation without resistance. 14. You become untouchable when nothing inside you needs defense. Buddhism teaches that the deepest strength is not the power to fight, argue, or explain, but the ability to remain steady when the world does not move as you expect. At this stage of inner maturity, you stop explaining not because you are tired, angry, or withdrawn, but because nothing inside you feels threatened anymore. Defense disappears when there is nothing left to protect. This is not numbness, this is clarity. This is the quiet understanding that your inner peace no longer depends on outcomes, opinions, or approval. For much of life, defense feels necessary. You defend your character, your intentions, your choices, and even your silence. This constant defense grows from fear, the fear of being misjudged, rejected, blamed, or erased. Buddhism teaches that fear appears when the mind believes something essential can be taken away. At this level of awareness, you understand that nothing essential about you can be removed by misunderstanding. What you are is deeper than story, deeper than reputation, deeper than explanation. When this understanding settles, the urge to defend fades naturally. Being untouchable does not mean nothing affects you emotionally. It means emotions no longer control you. Buddhism teaches that emotions are movements within awareness, not orders that must be followed. Earlier on the path, emotions often directed speech. You explained because discomfort pushed you to talk. Now, awareness comes first. You feel emotions fully, but you do not build stories around them. You let them rise and fall without turning them into arguments or defenses. This is why peace becomes steady instead of fragile. When nothing inside you needs defense, outer conflict loses its grip. Criticism may still appear, but it no longer cuts deeply. Misunderstanding may still happen, but it no longer stays in the mind. Silence from others may still occur, but it no longer feels like abandonment. Buddhism teaches equanimity, the ability to remain balanced in gain and loss, praise and blame. At this stage, equanimity is no longer something you practice, it is something you live. This inner untouchability also changes how you move through conversations. You no longer listen in order to correct or prepare a reply. You listen openly without tension. If something untrue is said about you, the body no longer reacts with urgency. You do not rush to fix the story because your inner truth is already clear. Buddhism teaches that clarity within removes the need for correction outside. When you know who you are, you do not feel forced to announce it. As defense fades, your presence becomes calm and grounded. People may sense this without knowing why. Some may feel drawn to your steadiness. Others may feel uneasy around it because it offers no emotional leverage. Buddhism does not teach changing yourself to keep others comfortable at the cost of truth. It teaches authenticity rooted in awareness. When you are authentic without defense, you become unpredictable in a healthy way, not reactive, not easily provoked, not easily controlled. This stage also creates a new relationship with boundaries. Earlier, boundaries may have needed explanation, justification, or firmness to hold. Now, boundaries exist without words. You do not need to explain why you step back, why you stay silent, or why you do not engage. Your energy communicates what your words no longer need to. Buddhism teaches that presence itself is a form of communication. When your presence is steady, boundaries are felt, not negotiated. Being untouchable does not mean you withdraw from compassion. In fact, compassion deepens. When you no longer feel threatened, you can see others more clearly. You recognize that many attempts to provoke, judge, or misunderstand come from pain, insecurity, or confusion. Buddhism teaches compassion with wisdom, compassion that does not require self-sacrifice. You can understand someone's suffering without carrying it. You can stay kind without becoming tangled. This balance is only possible when defense has ended. At this level, even injustice feels different. You may still see unfairness, but it does not shake you inside. You respond when action is needed, but without inner agitation. Buddhism teaches right action, guided by awareness, not by emotional reaction. When nothing inside needs defense, action becomes clean. You speak when speech brings clarity. You stay silent when silence protects peace. There is no inner argument, no lingering regret, no mental replay. As this way of being settles, life feels less confrontational. You no longer see the world as something constantly testing you. Buddhism teaches that much of perceived hostility comes from inner resistance. When resistance ends, the world feels softer, even if circumstances stay the same. This softness is not weakness. It is openness without fear. You meet life directly, without armor, without explanation, without defense. A deep sense of dignity also appears. You no longer feel the need to justify your existence or prove your worth. You stand quietly within yourself. Buddhism teaches that dignity comes from alignment, not assertion. When you are aligned with awareness, you do not need to announce it. Your life shows it naturally. This dignity is calm, steady, and humble. It does not compete. It does not compare. It simply exists. Being untouchable also reshapes your relationship with the past. Earlier, past misunderstandings may have stayed in memory, replaying as unfinished moments. Now, the past slowly loosens its hold. Buddhism teaches impermanence, not as forgetting, but as letting go. Memories may still appear, but they no longer demand explanation or repair. You let them pass without reopening old wounds. The mind grows lighter because it is no longer carrying unfinished defenses. At this stage, silence is effortless. You are not holding back speech. You are simply not pushed to speak. There is a difference. Buddhism teaches that freedom is the end of compulsion. When the need to defend fades, speech becomes free instead of reactive. You speak from choice, not from pressure. This freedom is deeply peaceful. You are no longer bargaining with the world to feel safe. Eventually, you see that being untouchable is not about others losing power over you, but about you reclaiming your own. Power in Buddhism is not dominance, it is mastery of the inner world. When nothing inside needs defense, the inner world becomes open, quiet, and strong. Outer events still happen, but they no longer decide your state of being. You stop explaining because explanation belonged to a time when something inside felt threatened. Now there is only awareness meeting experience. You do not harden, you do not withdraw. You stay open, present, and grounded. This openness without defense is real strength. It is the strength of someone who has stopped fighting life and started living it fully. Buddhism points to this state not as a finish line, but as a natural sign of awakening. You become untouchable, not by building walls, but by dissolving fear. When fear fades, defense fades. When defense fades, peace remains. And in that peace, life moves freely, without explanation, without resistance, and without inner conflict. You live without inner argument, and life finally feels light. Buddhism teaches that the heaviest burden a person carries is not pain, loss, or difficulty, but the constant inner argument with reality. This argument takes many shapes. It argues with how people see you. It argues with what was said or left unsaid. It argues with what should have happened instead of what did. It argues with silence, misunderstanding, rejection, and even peace itself. For much of life, this inner argument feels normal, even necessary, because the mind believes it must negotiate with reality to feel safe. At this stage of awareness, that argument ends, and with its ending, life becomes light. Inner argument is subtle. It does not always look like anger or open resistance. Often it appears as quiet replay in the mind, as justification, as self-defense, as explanations repeated long after the moment is over. Buddhism teaches that suffering is created not by experience, but by the mind refusing to let experience finish. Every time you replay, explain, or correct internally, you reopen what has already closed. This habit keeps the body tight and the mind restless. When you stop explaining outwardly and inwardly, the cycle finally breaks. Living without inner argument does not mean life becomes perfect or easy. It means challenges no longer start inner war. When something hard happens, you feel it fully, without turning it into a story that needs fixing. You let emotions move through awareness without making them into identity. Buddhism teaches mindful presence, the ability to stay with experience without adding resistance. When resistance fades, pain stays pain, but suffering dissolves. This difference changes everything. As the inner argument quiets, the mind grows calmer, not because thoughts vanish, but because thoughts no longer demand attention. Earlier, every misunderstanding dragged you into explanation, spoken or silent. Now, misunderstandings rise and pass like weather. You notice them without taking them in. You do not chase closure in every moment because you understand not every moment needs it. Buddhism teaches acceptance not as passivity, but as clarity. Acceptance is seeing that reality does not need your approval to unfold. This clarity brings a gentle lightness. You move through your days without the weight of unfinished talks, imagined defenses, or expected judgment. The mind no longer scans for threats to identity. You stop bracing yourself emotionally. The body relaxes because it is no longer preparing for conflict that may never arrive. Buddhism teaches that the body mirrors the mind's relationship with life. When the mind stops fighting, the body follows. Living without inner argument also changes how you meet others. You no longer enter conversations with hidden plans to be understood or validated. You listen without planning your reply. You speak without rehearsing how your words will land. Buddhism teaches right speech as speech that comes from awareness rather than fear. When awareness leads, communication becomes simpler and more honest. Silence feels natural instead of planned. Words become fewer but carry more meaning. As this way of being settles, you notice you are no longer trying to control outcomes. Earlier, explanation was a way to shape how situations turned out. Now you trust the unfolding itself. Buddhism teaches trust in impermanence, the understanding that everything changes whether we interfere or not. When you trust change, you stop gripping the present. You let life move without pulling it backward through explanation or pushing it forward through anticipation. This trust reshapes your relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a danger that must be solved right away. It becomes an open space instead of anxiety. Buddhism teaches that uncertainty is part of reality, not a defect in it. When you stop arguing with uncertainty, it loses the power to disturb you. You wait without tension. You act without panic. You rest without demanding answers. Living without inner argument also brings humility. You no longer assume your view must be understood or shared. You recognize that each person lives inside a mental world shaped by experiences you may never see. Buddhism teaches humility as wisdom, the understanding that perception is limited and personal. This humility softens judgment toward yourself and others. You stop needing to be right. You become more interested in being present. As the inner argument fades, compassion deepens on its own. Without the constant focus on defending yourself, attention opens outward. You see suffering more clearly, including your own past suffering, without needing to explain or justify it. Buddhism teaches compassion rooted in awareness rather than emotion alone. You can feel deeply without being overwhelmed. You can care without losing balance. This compassion is steady, because it is not tied to identity. Lightness also appears in how you experience time. Earlier the mind lived in the past through regret and in the future through anticipation. Now, time feels less heavy. You are more present because there is less mental noise pulling you away. Buddhism teaches that presence is the ground of peace. When inner argument ends, presence becomes effortless. You are here not because you force it, but because your attention has nowhere else it needs to go. Even silence shifts again at this stage. Silence is no longer something you choose. It is something that happens naturally when nothing is left to argue. You do not hold back speech. You simply do not feel pushed to speak. Buddhism teaches that freedom is the end of compulsion. When compulsion ends, life becomes simple. You speak when clarity appears. You stay silent when clarity is already there. There is no tension in either. Living without inner argument does not make you distant. It makes you free. You still care. You still engage. You still respond when response is needed. But you no longer carry life as a burden that must be fixed. You carry it lightly, moment by moment, trusting awareness to guide your actions. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not escape from life, but closeness with life without resistance. This closeness feels like ease. At this level, you see that stopping explanation was never only about silence. It was about ending the habit of fighting reality in the mind. When that habit ends, peace does not need to be built. It is uncovered. Life feels lighter, not because circumstances changed, but because the inner weight has been put down. You no longer live as if life must justify itself to you, or as if you must justify yourself to life. You live in cooperation instead of opposition. You accept without giving up. You engage without attachment. Buddhism points to this way of living as the middle way, balanced, grounded, and free from extremes. In this freedom there is a quiet joy that does not announce itself. It is not excitement. It is not achievement. It is the relief of no longer carrying an unnecessary burden. You move through the world without inner commentary, arguing for or against what is happening. You are present, responsive, and at ease. You live without inner argument, and life finally feels light, not because it became easy, but because you stopped making it heavy. As this teaching settles, remember that stopping explanation is not withdrawal from life, but a return to it. You did not lose your voice by becoming silent. You found your center. You did not lose clarity by detaching quietly. You discovered a deeper truth that does not need defense. Buddhism reminds us that peace does not arrive when the world finally understands us, agrees with us, or treats us fairly. Peace arrives when we stop demanding that life meet conditions before we allow ourselves to rest. When you stop explaining, you are no longer running from misunderstanding or chasing validation. You are standing steady in awareness, letting life move around you instead of pulling you into every current. Detachment does not mean you care less. It means you care wisely. You no longer pour energy into places that cannot receive it. You allow time, action, and truth to speak without interference. Slowly, you notice that what is real remains, while what was never aligned falls away without force. This path is quiet, and because it is quiet, it is often misunderstood. Buddhism teaches that the deepest changes are not loud. They are small shifts in perception, gentle releases of attachment, and soft returns to presence. You may not feel different overnight, but one day you will realize the urge to explain has faded. Silence no longer feels heavy, and peace is no longer something you chase. It is simply there, waiting where it always was. Carry this understanding gently into your life. Speak when compassion and clarity call for it. Stay silent when silence protects your peace. Do not measure your growth by how much others notice it. Measure it by how little you are disturbed by what no longer belongs to you. Buddhism teaches that freedom is found not in control but in release, not in resistance but in acceptance, not in explanation but in presence. When you detach quietly, life reveals everything in its own time, not to punish anyone, not to defend you, but to restore balance. And in that balance you find a calm that cannot be shaken by misunderstanding, a strength that does not need defense, and a peace that no longer asks for permission. Let life unfold, let silence settle, let understanding come when it comes. You are already enough, already whole, and already at rest the moment you stop trying to prove it. And from that stillness, walk forward lightly. Today, ask yourself these questions and let these journal practice guide you back to yourself. 1. When I feel the need to explain myself, what attachment am I holding that causes suffering? 2. What would happen if I allowed silence to protect my peace instead of words to protect my image? 3. Which relationship teaches me the lesson of letting go, and what is it trying to show me? 4. Where am I resisting reality instead of accepting it as it is? 5. If I trust karma and time to show the truth, how would I act today? Take a moment, close your eyes, and let your thoughts settle.